Hello everybody, this is the last video. Maybe we'll do something for the final exam, I don't know. But this video is really going to it's going to go super fast. I'm going to show you some slides. You've seen almost all of them already, but just because test 4 was kind of scrunched in terms of our coverage, I want to make sure you had one more chance to hear the most important topics. So if you hear it in this video, it's important. I'm not saying ignore the other stuff, but you certainly want to feel comfortable with the topics that I will address here. So some of the things that you'll want to be able to do, and again, the slides will go super fast, is you do want to be able to describe the divisions of the nervous system, the functional divisions, CNS and PNS. The peripheral nervous system has a sensory and a motor part, and you'll see that slide here in a moment. So be able to list the parts of the CNS and protections for the CNS. And by protections, let me get why is it not working here? Hang on. There we go. For protections, think again about how the nervous system is protected. Central nervous system, that is. Scalp and skin do relatively little. Remember the skull, meninges, the cerebral spinal fluid, and the blood-brain barrier, the astrocytes, are very important barriers to protect the central nervous system because it is so vital. So do go back and look at these. In particular, I want you to go back and look at the cerebral spinal fluid again. That is very important in terms of what it does. Go back and look at its major functions, including to provide a cushion to help float the brain, to help nourish the brain. Remember where it's produced. Remember the kind of cells that produce it, and also how it circulates, and finally where the fluid ends up once it has circulated around the brain and spinal cord. Do also go back and look at spinal cord injuries and brain injuries. So when we talk about these, we've talked about specific deficits that you can associate with spinal cord transection. Here you see, for example, C4 injuries, tetraplegia or quadriplegia, meaning a complete quadriplegic. So remember that where you are on the spinal cord actually does determine the degree of deficit that someone's going to have. Also go back and look at the brain injuries. I think I have, oops, because I don't have it on here. Go back and look at these. We talked about concussions and subdural and epidural hematomas. We discussed lacerations. Do go back and look at the major symptoms of traumatic brain injuries and some of the effects on the brain. That is there going to be swelling? Is there going to be microscopic damage, etc.? How do we assess the CNS? Remember, aside from looking at cerebral spinal fluid that we can access via a spinal tap, imaging, looking at loss of reflexes, loss of function. What you're seeing here are the dermatomes that we actually can assess the sensory ability of someone if they have a specific spinal cord injury. So reminder to go back and look at how we assess the CNS. Look at the reflex arc. You should know the parts of the reflex arc and the difference between somatic and autonomic reflexes. You should be able to describe the connective tissue that makes up a nerve as well as the parts of a nerve. Again, these are all familiar slides. The parts of the brain. You should know the major functional regions, that is the brainstem, the midbrain, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. And we'll look at some localization here in a second. Do recall the hemispheres are divided. You have the left and right hemisphere separated by a longitudinal fissure. So make sure you understand that, as well as how the two sides communicate. The hemispheres communicate via the corpus callosum. Don't get too detailed with this view, but I do want you to go back and be able to describe some basic locations of some basic functions. For example, the occipital lobe is what we associate with vision. The temporal lobe is what we associate more with hearing and taste. The the primary somatic and primary motor areas are here around the central sulcus. So please go back and make sure you look at these just in general. How do we know what we know about the brain? Recall that we are looking at a number of ways we can determine stuff about the brain. This is a functional MRI. We discussed when someone was speaking, certain parts of the brain light up, become more metabolically active. And we also know a lot about the brain as we look at people who have suffered brain injuries. We mentioned in one of the videos about James Brady, President Reagan's press secretary. If somebody of those suffers any kind of brain injury, their deficits can sometimes help us understand better how the brain operates. If they have a specific injury, a specific deficit, then that helps us go back and figure out that part of the brain must control that function. We also study the brain via electrical studies, that is from EEGs, and we can look at normal brain activity, epileptic brain activity as a function of measuring brain activity, of course, but also to understand that the brain is electrical and the signals that are being transmitted are how the brain cells, the neurons, communicate with each other. Do go back and look at consciousness. Consciousness is a very important attribute of the brain, and as you go back and look at that, look at the definition. What is consciousness but a continuum? It's not completely conscious or completely unconscious typically. It's on a continuum, and we do have some defining features, that is brain activity and metabolic oxygen usage. So here's my brain injury slide. Go back then and look at the brain injuries, including when we talk about the difference between subdural and epidural hematomas, difference between a concussion and a contusion and laceration. You should be familiar with these. As you get to the senses, recognize again that the senses are going to be divided into general and specialized. General senses are going to be those that we associate with receptors all over the body versus special receptors, special senses, which have receptors which will be localized in the head. Do go back and look particularly at pain, the difference between somatic and visceral pain. Referred pain will certainly be on the test as well. For the particular senses, I don't want you to spend a lot of time going back and learning all of the pieces to every sense, but you should associate a sense with its receptors, how a receptor potential gets started, how that sense in general works. For example, with olfactory, there has to be the dissolving of odorants into the mucus, which actually binds to the cilia. That's how a receptor potential starts in this sense. When you talk about chemoreception for taste, you should know the basics of how a taste gets started. Once again, the taste gustatory receptor cells are located here within the cell proper. The taste pores are here. Molecules enter the taste pores. They bind to the receptors, stimulate the cranial nerve to stimulate a impulse. So please understand the basics of how the special senses operate. It's a very fair question for me to ask is pathways. What's the pathway of sound through the ear? What's the pathway of light through the eye? So make sure you understand enough anatomy to be able to describe pathways. When you get to things like how the hearing occurs, how the ear works, you again want to understand the basics of the process. In this case, I have a slide here. Remember that ultimately hearing is the determination of two major factors, the frequency and the amplitude or the volume. So when you get to the basics of a sense, you should understand how the body translates a chemoreception or a vibration or a light wave into an impulse. I'm not sure why I put this one in here, but you should remember the basics of the lacrimal apparatus, how the tears form. I wanted you to see this one. Parts of the eye, very fair game. You should know the parts of the eye, how light passes through it, how light gets refracted, how light gets bent as it travels through the eye. And with all of the senses, I want you to pay attention to the abnormalities or the lack of function. What is anosmia? What is myopia? What is, hyperopic eye? What is astigmatism? What is phantom pain? You should be aware of some basic pathologies with the senses. With the cranial nerves, as I mentioned before, I don't want you to go through and memorize these. I'd much rather you understand that cranial nerves are peripheral nerves that associate from the brain, but they're not part of the CNS, and that they're numbered from anterior to posterior 1 to 12. It would be helpful if you knew some of the names, just because that might help you understand their it might help you for lab understand where's where, but I'm not going to say, is the trochlear nerve motor or sensory. I think the questions can be more general on the test. For the autonomic nervous system, you should have a pretty good understanding of autonomic in general, what it does. This is going to be a motor responses that you do not control. Sympathetic and parasympathetic work pretty much antagonistically, as both sides will innervate a particular part. For example, both will affect the lungs, but they affect it in opposite ways. So you should understand the difference between parasympathetic and sympathetic. If a sympathetic response occurs, what are the general responses? That is, how does the body generally respond to fight or flight? Flip side, how does the body generally respond to parasympathetic nerve impulses? And finally, for the endocrine system, you should understand the basics here, which means you should be able to distinguish between exocrine and endocrine glands. You should be able to identify endocrine glands and discuss major classes of hormones. The difference between lipid-soluble and water-soluble hormones is important in terms of how long they last and where they bind to the receptors. And I do want you to pay attention to hormone interaction, because this is really a key area in physiology. Hormones can actually amplify each other, that is, synergistically affect each other, or work in opposition. I do want you to be aware of hormones like thyroid hormone or oxytocin or ADH, but I want to focus on two just to remind you of what I could be looking for. We just spent a lot of time with PTH and calcium. Just expect that will be on the test. You should be familiar with how does PTH increase calcium levels in the bloodstream, and you should also be familiar with the antagonistic relationship between glucagon and insulin. How does insulin change blood sugar? How does glucagon change blood sugar? And why are they considered antagonistic? And finally, we spent a little time on diabetes. I do want you to pay attention to the difference between type 1 and type 2. Which one is insulin dependent? Which one is not? How can a body become non-insulin dependent? What are the risk factors for diabetes, and what are some of the potential consequences? And you see those listed here on the right. So that's a very quick overview. I don't want you to get in the weeds. I want you to pay attention to big themes. Again, the central nervous system and the brain and the spinal cord and all the peripheral nerves, and you can spend a lot of time on these areas, and we just did not spend as much time as you really could to do them a lot of detail. So feel that when you go back to this video, if you need to look at it again, focus on broader themes. Do understand processes. Again, pathways are important, processes are important, feedbacks are important, but don't get too bogged down in all the details, because it is a lot to look at. Okay, that's this review video. I hope it's helpful. Again, please don't ignore other stuff that we looked at, but these areas are considered among the more important ones to focus on. That's it. Thanks.